I hope you're well. In this one, I'll be fitting a wide-kerf, flat ground grooving blade to the little Festool table saw, and I'll look at what I needed to do to the saw to make that work, why anybody would want to do this, and to what end result a little bit later on. I'll also show you some alternative ways that you could achieve the same result without a blade like this. Before we get to any of that though, I do want to be clear that I'm not recommending this in any way. I'm just showing you what's possible and what I've done to make this work and why I did it, so that you can make an informed decision for yourself. In fact, let's start with the why. So a few years back, I made these plywood shelves for the workshop. This was part of the basic build series, a set of videos that used a minimal tool set, an entry-level plunge saw, and a drill to make an MFT-style bench to start with, and then some basic projects that were good practice pieces if you were new to the whole making thing. And with each build, we'd add one more basic tool that increased the range of work that you could take on, and so on. The shelves have been really good, and I designed them with a pelmet to the front edge, mostly for structural strength, but I also added notches in there to store my rail clamps. It's a good solution. It keeps them off the bench, but always within reach. The problem is that when I made the shelves, I only had maybe 10 clamps. Now I've got over 20 or more, and adding extra notches into the pelmet in situ is actually quite hard to do. I've tried all kinds of different ways, drilling a hole, then chiseling it out. I've cut down a multi-tool blade and tried cutting the notches with a template that worked pretty well, but the holes looked like they'd been chewed through by an angry beaver. And a big part of the appeal was the tidiness, the neatness of the holes, the regular spacing. So I ended up just pulling the pelmet off. It was only glued on originally, and it came off fairly cleanly. I cut a replacement strip of birch ply for the new pelmet, then realized that the pelmet was actually deep enough for me to add another row of holes underneath the first, but offset, so the clamp handles didn't clash. Now, cutting a row of notches into the edge of a piece of plywood isn't particularly challenging, but cutting a nice, neat row of identical and regularly spaced rectangular holes, and these are only 8 by 12 millimeters or so, that's actually quite hard to do with the tools that I have on hand. Now, the obvious thing to do, of course, was to rip the pelmet into two, cut both rows as notches, then glue the two halves back together. And obviously, if you staggered the two strips and tape them together, you could cut both the upper and lower notches at the same time. They're staggered so that the grain still matches when you glue them back together. So that's kind of where we are with the pelmet. Cutting the notches in the original, I used a track saw to take out the bulk of the waste and then cleaned up the bottom edges with a chisel. Most saw blades have a slightly angled bottom edge to the teeth, as this helps to give a clean through cut. On a cut that's stopped though, like a trenching cut or grooving cut, this will give a slightly ridged base that doesn't look particularly good. Blades that are designed for grooving are flat ground, so they leave a clean bottom to the cut. I have one for my track saw by Saxton, and it'll fit my little table saw, but the blade curve is only 2.2 millimeters wide, so a 12 millimeter wide notch would need at least 5 or 6 passes, and I have about a dozen of these notches to do. CMT make a flat ground grooving blade with a much wider kerf, one in 4 millimeters and 6 millimeters. I've seen Matt from Badger Workshop and Keith from Rangabone Brown both using these on projects in the past, and they seem like a very good, albeit slightly scary option for us here in the UK and EU, where dado stacks are not widely available or compatible necessarily with the saws that we have. Now, using those CMT blades on my little Festool saw presents a few challenges. The blades are smaller physically than the standard blade, but they're also much thicker, both the kerf and the blade body. They're also a 13 millimeter bore, whereas the Festool saw takes standard track saw blades at 20 millimeters bore, so you need to use a reducing ring, which isn't ideal. And the CMT blades are also much heavier too. In itself, not a big problem, but that extra mass when it's spinning could put additional strain on the blade braking mechanism, and that's one of the reasons why dado stacks just aren't as widely used here. But we don't know until we try. I opted for reducing rings by Bosch. These have a slightly serrated edge and fit very snugly into the 30 millimeter CMT bore. They are a little bit more expensive, but the snug fit inspires a lot more confidence than the ones that just sit in there and spin. Just by offering the blade up to the saw, I could see that the thicker kerf wasn't going to be a problem with the throw plate, but it was definitely going to snag on the black internal blade cover. I think this is principally to help with dust collection, and I was loosening the retaining screw on the left-hand side to see if I could pack this out with a washer to get enough clearance, when the whole side cover just came completely away. It looks like it's clipped in on the right side, and that one screw on the left keeps it all together. With the cover removed, the 4mm blade worked just fine, albeit with reduced dust collection, obviously. But when I fitted the 6mm blade, it was catching slightly on the translucent bottom blade cover. That's the one that can be swung down out of the way to help clear any debris that's fallen through the throw plate. This stopped being a problem when I dropped the cover down, so I opted to live with a slightly worse dust collection for the handful of cuts that I was planning to make. The CMT blade is a slightly smaller diameter, and I could have reset the depth display for this blade, but again, I just opted for an easy life and left it alone. I'm happy working off the table to set the height of cut and make test cuts, and you can still use the digital dingers to adjust the relative height. And I'll say again what a pleasure it is to be able to adjust the height by fractions of a millimeter on this saw. When an 8mm cut is a little snug, going to 9mm seems much too loose, and it really is sweet to have a little bit of middle ground between them. As expected, an unsupported test cut left a lot of tear out on the back of the ply, but that was easily resolved with a sacrificial backer from thin MDF just taped to the mitre fence. To get the notches evenly spaced, I added a little flag to a piece of plywood that sits in the trough where the fence is usually. The flag is the same width as the blade kerf. That took a little bit of careful sanding. And by making a test notch, then lining up where I wanted the second notch to be, I could position the flag and tape it down. Because the workpiece is so wide, I added some rudimentary support to the left side of the saw, and then I was pretty much good to go with the notches. Now the way this is set up with a flag is just going to duplicate the first notch, so I'm just going to cut another quick test to make sure we're all good. And then I can run the notches all the way along to the mark that I made earlier. Okay, so that's worked out pretty nicely. I'm going to try and prise this apart. I might just glue it up and leave it to the glue to go off while the dust settles. Yeah, not having a dust collection on that isn't great, but there you go. Let's see how these match up. Squeeze a bit of glue in there and see how we get on. So that's the top face, and that's the bottom. Okay, I'm going to leave that adhesive to set. I'll come back to that, get it trimmed, sanded, and fitted back. I might not glue it back on there. I might pop a couple of screws in instead this time, but we'll see how that goes. I'll come back when this is done. So there we are, that's us all pretty much done. I'm really quite happy with that overall result. The double stacking for the clamps works really well. Got all my clamps on there now, and room for growth as well. Got my hex keys in there. Put them in a little bit lower down so I can number them as well, which is going to be really useful. And I do like this sort of vertical pelmet because it does mean I can just put the little spring clamps on the end there. I said at the start that I'd look at alternatives for putting those notches in. The grooving blade worked extremely well, but it does have a cost attached. It is very fast. As I said, we don't generally have dado blades, dado stacks available to us here in the UK or in the EU because of issues with the blade breaking mechanism. I don't see any problems using it with the little Festool saw. The blade breaking on cordless tools is particularly aggressive, so I don't think there's any great issue there. As I say, I haven't made any permanent changes to the internals of the saw, and I will be putting back the blade cover and everything else because these kind of grooving blades aren't something that I'm going to be using very regularly. It's just something that's useful to have in your arsenal. I made this one originally just by hogging out the slots with a track saw and then cleaning them up with a chisel. That's a perfectly valid way of doing it. The other way you could do it is to do that and then use a router to clean those the bottoms of the slots up. The problem with this kind of workpiece is that it's very wide, and moving it front to back in order to get those cuts cleanly is a bit of a challenge. I couldn't do it on my router bench. If I had a smaller router table, I might be able to rig up a jig or something. Maybe that's for a future video. You can, of course, 3D print something like this. I've seen a couple of things online. A couple of people have pointed them out to me. Thank you very much, everybody. I said at the start, a large part of this sort of pelmet is for the strength and stability of the set of shelves. It's a good thing to get into. It's a good practice generally to have something like that. Not necessarily for a set of shelves like this that are made of plywood and very shallow front to back. But if you have a bigger set of shelves that might be prone to a bit of sagging, then certainly a front sort of plinth or support like that is very much worth having. But I'll call this one done for this week. Thanks so much for taking a look. As I said at the start, I'm not recommending this at all, but if you're curious about how one of these blades might work, they are definitely a time saver and the closest thing that we'll get to a dado stack here in the UK and probably the EU as well. Anyway, thanks so much for taking a look. Got any questions? Leave them in the comments for me downstairs, down below. And I'll see you in the next one. All right, take care.